Good afternoon, Raz. How are you?
Hi, Bassam. I'm okay. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I am very excited that you are with us today to address a set of important topics to follow up on our conversation about your background and intellectual influences, and more than that, actually. At this point, we are going to be talking about, or going to start with the history of anti Semitism and move to the issue of weaponizing anti Semitism all the way to the current manifestations during this genocide, especially in the United States, when we are witnessing a lot of people losing jobs, being targeted, attacked, harassed. Where the ironic thing is that it is presented as a situation where the people who are being fired and the people who are on the side of the critique of what's happening in Gaza are the ones who are maligned, which is a very interesting, phenomenon. But we will talk about that, and then we would also talk about your situation with the University of Minnesota job offer, which was rescinded in some way, and maybe that would be a good start, so it can get our references triggered.
Sure. Sure. So yeah, I mean, as it's not a secret, of course, that in early June, on the 5th of June, following lengthy and regular, search process, I was offered the position of the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities. And together with a tenured position in the associate professor in the history department. And 5 days later, on 10th of June, the interim president of the university then, Ettinger, withdrew the offer following a campaign against me that was led by the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Minnesota and the Dakotas, the JCRC, on the basis of what I said and wrote on the nature of Israel's attack on Gaza as genocide. The pressure, as I said, worked, because very quickly, 5 days later, on 10th of June, Ettinger withdrew this job offer. I mean, there's a lot to say about this, and I've written and spoken about it previously, and others have written and spoken about this. But the key point, I think, to make that's relevant for our discussion today on anti-Semitism and its weaponization, and the struggle against anti-Semitism, and the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, because that's really what's weaponized here, right? What's weaponized is a struggle against anti-Semitism, is that the withdrawal of the offer was not based in any way on my academic and professional credentials, which were actually the basis for the offer, right? It was based purely on what I said and wrote about Israel's attack, genocidal attack on Gaza. So one thing to say about this immediately and quite obviously is that this is a First Amendment issue, right? This is a crude violation of First Amendment rights, and of course, crude violation of academic freedom. Because, of course, I'm speaking about Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza from a professional and academic perspective, right, as a scholar of genocide. So these two kinds of attacks on First Amendment rights and then on academic freedom are quite obvious in this case. And it's important, of course, to stress that some people have said, well, we have two pieces here. We have the academic position in the history department, and we have the center directorship, and the center directorship is kind of an administrative position. So is it actually protected by academic freedom? And the answer is actually yes, absolutely. And even higher administrators in the University of Minnesota have admitted that the center directorship is actually a faculty position as well, right? It's a faculty member who's the center director. So in that sense, yes, it's also protected by academic freedom. And the person holding this position is, tasked with creating programming and other duties that are based on their academic and professional expertise. So it is protected by academic freedom. But the key issue here that's related to our discussion is that, interestingly, to use that word, right, I was attacked here because of my Jewish identity as an anti-Zionist Jew, right? So the attack was actually did not engage in any significant way in what I actually said and wrote about Israel's attack on Gaza as genocide, right? There was no engagement in the actual arguments, right? And there was actually no engagement in anything that I've written and said about Israel-Palestine, also before the 7th of October, was referenced by the people who attacked me in some cases in these articles after the 5th of June, after the job offer. But there was no serious engagement. It was just referenced that, Raz Segal said that Israel is an apartheid state. Not good. Right? So there was no serious engagement with the professional and academic expertise, right? The attack was the fact that I said that, the fact that I wrote that, right? My position, which I've never, hidden, that I am an anti-Zionist Jew. Now, this is very important because this means that I am attacked as a Jew here, and I'm attacked because of my Jewish identity, because of the way I express my Jewish identity. This actually makes the attack on me, right, anti-Semitic, right? And this is a key issue to understand. The weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, the fact that the attack against me was presented by the JCRC, by the people who attacked me, right, as part of the struggle against anti-Semitism, right, that this would be, this would insert more anti-Semitism into the University of Minnesota somehow, right? This kind of weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism is itself, right, engaging in anti-Semitic discourse and in anti-Semitic acts by singling out really any Jews who identify as Jews in any other way than Zionism, right? And specifically anti-Zionist Jews. Right, so this is this really makes this attack really an anti-Semitic attack against me. It really makes the move of the University of Minnesota here a discriminatory move, right? A discriminatory anti-Semitic move against me as an anti-Zionist Jew. And in this way, it very much relates to what we're going to be talking about today.
All right, let's move back a bit in history and talk a little bit about the history of anti-Semitism as a prelude to what has transpired henceforth, not least what we are witnessing today.
Yeah, so, in order to understand the struggle against anti-Semitism, in order to understand the weaponization of the struggle, really in the last 25 years, this is a project that has been going on. It's an Israeli project that has been going on for at least 25 years. We'll get to that. Then we have to understand something about the history of anti-Semitism itself, right? And what I want to point out here very briefly, right, is we can't understand anti-Semitism as a truly modern phenomena, right? So I'm explicitly here trying to suggest that we, talking about this framework of quote unquote the longest hatred, for example, right? That always people have hated Jews throughout history, from antiquity to the present, that somehow we can talk about anti-Semitism from ancient Egypt all the way to critique of the state of Israel today, that everything, right, and everywhere is anti-Semitism, right, is a very big problem because there are actually very specific elements of anti-Semitism that make it a specifically modern phenomena that are different from past manifestations of anti-Jewish ideas and anti-Jewish violence, anti-Jewish animosity, and so on and so forth. And it's also important, of course, to say that if we take, a very long span of time, as I said, for example, from ancient Egypt to today, right, and say that all these phenomena we can group under this concept of anti-Semitism, then it's completely decontextualized view. History doesn't matter, right? No time, no place, no specific interactions, policies, unbelievable changes in the span of time, right? So it's kind of like a decontextualized view that aspires to explain everything, and as we know in these cases, it ends up explaining nothing, right? So it's very important to focus on anti-Semitism, this use of the term, which really emerges, right, in the late 19th century in a very specific context in Germany, or the German Empire at the time, among people who call themselves proudly anti-Semites, right, and they actually have a very specific political goal, that is to reverse Jewish emancipation in Germany, and then this spreads also to Hungary, then as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So to reverse Jewish emancipation, that is the gradual process throughout the 19th century of Jews becoming more and more equal citizens, right? These anti-Semites say, no, we have to return Jews to their place, quote unquote, right, as second-class citizens at best, tolerated and so on and so forth, but not equal in any way. And this is a very important. So this emerges, as I said, in late 19th century in German among people who call themselves proudly anti-Semites, right, and they have a specific political goal. And this is important because it ties into the rise of nationalism, right? And it really becomes very, very important after World War I, with the collapse, actually, of the imperial world in Europe and the rise of the nation-state system after World War I. And this nation-state system emerges with ideas about nationalism that are exclusionary and discriminatory. That is, the nation, right, has a state in a bordered territory, right? And the state belongs to the nation, right? And therefore, any other people who live in that bordered area that are not part of the nation, and that could be Germans, Hungarians, Poles, whatever, then they essentially immediately become, right, people who don't really belong where they are and where they had always lived in many cases and where they had lived for generations, right? They become foreign, right? Foreigners, and more, they also are seen, right, by the dominant nation and its leaders as threats, as dangerous, as security threats, right? So the emergence of this exclusionary nation-state system is absolutely essential to understand modern anti-Semitism, because, of course, Jews in the system, but not only Jews, right? But Jews, and we can also think about another group that was, by the way, a key victim of the Nazis and their allies, Roma, right? Become key, quote-unquote, problems, right? That's why we have the Jewish problem, the Jewish question. And by the way, not only that, I mean, this is an era that, as we know, takes people and places and turns them into questions and problems, right? We have the Transylvanian question, the Macedonian question, right? The Armenian question, the Jewish question, so on and so forth. So, right, we're in an era that, right, presents us with all kinds of questions that are in the framework of this exclusionary nation-state system, right? And when there's a question or a problem, we have to solve it, right? Therefore, we have, in the extreme case, of course, the final solution of the Jewish question, right? The Nazi, eventually, project to murder all Jews within their reach during World War II, right? But we can't understand Nazism, we can't understand the Holocaust, right, without understanding the nation-state system and nationalism. And of course, it's important to say right here that after the Nazis, after the Holocaust, after World War II, there was never a coming to terms with the nation-state system. Quite the opposite. There was a reproduction of the nation-state system, even in a more exclusionary, more extreme way, right? So the world that was created after World War II was not a world that responded to the problems that led us to World War II and the Holocaust and the Nazis, but quite the opposite. It reproduced these problems. I'll get to this in a minute, a bit more. So this is one context that's very important to understand. The other late modern context is imperialism, the late imperial world, and its settler outposts. And it's important to just, in this, connect it also to the rise of anti-Semitism, as I said, in the late 19th century in Germany, because, of course, these anti-Semites were thinking about the world through this new, indeed, imperial and colonial idea about race, right? So they were thinking in the language of races, and Jews, of course, in the frame as a race, right? And this is very important because, of course, the issue of race and race science, which is very important in that time period, is something that emerges in the colonial world, in the European empire building around the world, right? An interaction of Europeans with other sorts of people, and the way that eventually throughout the 19th century Europeans make sense of this world and their surprisingly superior position within it is through ideas about scientific ideas about race. Now, it's again impossible to understand anti-Semitism as a modern phenomenon also without the imperial and colonial world, not just because of the idea of race that of course becomes very important and also eventually leads us to Nazism and to World War II and the Holocaust. It's important also because we have to understand that the late imperial world is really a world of globalization, right? And this is where ideas about Jews assume a truly global dimension, right? It's not by accident that it's in the late 19th century, in this case in the Russian Empire, that we have the emergence of Jewish conspiracy theories, right? The protocols of the elders of Zion. But ideas about Jews assume now a global scale, but in very specific ways in relation to European empire building and its settler outposts. So, for example, right, are Jews, right, this powerful people who control the international economic system of imperialism, and colonialism, that is capitalism, right? Or are they this kind of primitive people in terms of race, right? And specifically, we can think about, for example, German Jews, this kind of inferior people according to race thinking, right? Or are they, as many of them were, actually part and parcel of German colonial administration in Africa, right? Because German Jews, who saw themselves first and foremost, of course, most of them as Germans, right? And proud and patriotic Germans, actually thought that the German colonial project in Africa, which was of course genocidal and very violent, right, was bringing European and specifically German civilization to Africa, right? So are they an inferior race, right? Or are they part of the German colonial imperial project in Africa, right? Are they powerful people that control the economic system around the world, this global economic system, right? Or are they actually related to their Arab-speaking neighbors in French and Italian colonial occupied North Africa, right? All these contradictions that emerged, of course, in relation to ideas about Jews, we can't understand them without the late imperial world and its settler outposts. And it's not by accident that if we take, for example, the case of France and Italy and their occupations in North Africa, that it's French and Italian settlers in North Africa that are at the forefront, right, of enacting anti-Semitic policies against Jews, not just in the French and Italian occupied areas in North Africa, but also in the center, right, in France and in Italy, right? And this is the way that I call this context, right, in a recent article, is settler anti-Semitism, right? And I say because we can't understand anti-Semitism, one, according to the nation-state system as a late modern phenomena, but also, right, in the framework of the late imperial world and its settler outposts, right, I think that we have to, in order to highlight this, I call this phenomena settler anti-Semitism. Come back to this in a minute as well. Now, all this is to say that from the emergence of anti-Semitism as a truly modern phenomenon in the late 19th century, as I said, and primarily in Germany, in the German Empire at the late 19th century, the struggle against anti-Semitism, because with anti-Semitism, right, that was, as I said, people announced themselves proudly as anti-Semites. There also emerged a concerted effort among Jews and among other people who supported Jews of struggling against anti-Semitism, right? And we have to understand that the struggle against anti-Semitism, so in the last, 150 years, say, right, to take this kind of broad view, right, essentially is a struggle, right, and certainly until World War II and the Nazis and the Holocaust, right, is a struggle to protect a people, Jews, right, from discriminatory and exclusionary and violent and eventually extremely violent states. Okay, that's this is, we have to understand, it may seem self-evident, right, but we have to say this because the weaponization of this struggle, right, in the last 25 years, which was in essence, again, the project to protect a people from states, from violent exclusionary states. The weaponization of the struggle turns this on its head, creates a world turned upside down, and says, no, no, no. Now, the struggle against anti-Semitism, which is an Israeli state project in the last 25 years, right, is actually to protect a state, Israel, a self-proclaimed Jewish state, but a state, right, from critique of its discrimination and exclusion and violence and eventually extreme violence against a group, Palestinians, right? So the focus now becomes not a people, Jews, but actually a state, Israel, right? So it's a world turned upside down. This is the essence of the weaponization, basically the conflation, okay, of a people and a state, Jews and Israel. Now, yes, Israel is a self-proclaimed Jewish state, but as we know today, 21% of its citizens, primarily Palestinians, right, are not Jews. Israel emerged precisely as the nations, in the frame of the reproduction of the nation-state system after World War II and the Holocaust. So it emerged as a nation-state, and in order to be absolutely clear about this, in 2018, as we know, it also enacted a basic law. Israel doesn't have a constitution, so it has a set of basic laws to replace a constitution, right? It enacted a new basic law, the Jewish nation-state basic law, that, by the way, employs specifically settler colonial language in order to say that Israel is a nation-state for Jews, right? And anyone else, basically, is a second-class citizen in effect, right? Actually, in law, in basic law, which is basically really the Israeli version of constitutional law, right? So Israel is a self-defined nation-state, right? And the conflation of a people, Jews, and a state, what it does is it also reaffirms this exclusionary framework, right? When we buy into the conflation of a people and a state, right, we actually say, yes, Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, not even talking about millions of Palestinians under decades of Israel occupation and siege and oppression, right, in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, but the citizens of the state, right, are not actually really, right, don't really have the status of citizens. They don't really belong in this. So all the ideas about the nation state and the people who don't really belong in it, right, including against before World War II now apply when we buy into the conflation of a state and of a people, right, which is an essential part of this weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism. We reaffirm the discrimination and the persecution of Palestinians in Israel, right? And it's important to say how it actually targets Jews, right, in a new way, with concepts about race, with concepts about a global economic system, with ideas about who belongs in a certain place, right, who really belongs in the nation-state system according to the view of the state, and how all this is then mobilized in the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, now not in order actually to continue to think about Jews. And we need to actually continue thinking about Jews because there is very real anti-Semitism in the world today, right? But in order now to shift the focus and say, no, we cannot actually critique Israel for its attack against a group because that's now anti-Semitism because it's a self-proclaimed Jewish state by conflating a people and a state, right? So it's not. So this is the reason that that I'm talking about, the history of anti-Semitism in this way, not in order to present a history of anti-Semitism, but just to talk about these elements.
Thank you, Raz. This is, succinct and exhaustive to the extent that it can be within that period. I really appreciate it. I need to move to ask you then, as a result of what we have been seeing in terms of the weaponization of anti-Semitism in reference to anyone critiquing Zionism specifically, not just Israel, what gives this claim gravity that if you critique Zionism, almost as opposed to or different from if you critique Israel, you are already anti-Semitic, Semitic, and this is something that we saw various institutions, individuals juggle, right, going back and forth, and then it seemed that you could critique Israel, and and that's that because all states can be critiqued, but once you approach Zionism, then it's an automatic label that you are anti-Semitic. Can you just tell us how to understand this and where does the gravity of that claim come from?
Well, this claim comes from the idea, again, from an idea that is a post-1948 idea, really. So after the establishment of Israel in 1948, through the 1948 war and the Nakba, the idea Zionism, or Israel actually, but Zionism and Israel here really kind of merge after 1948, and I'll say something about this as well. And the Holocaust become key elements of Jewish identity around the world, right? Which is a very new thing, right? Obviously in the Jewish world, right? The idea that, a state that did not exist before 1948, and of course the Holocaust, right, which happened during World War II, become these key pillars of Jewish identity around the world. Now, we have to understand something about, so this is where it comes from, right? This idea that critiquing Zionism is illegitimate, right? Because it's tied to critiquing a state that emerged in response to a genocide, okay? I'll say something more about this in a second, but we have to understand that when we think, and again, there's so much more to say about all of this, but when we think about Zionism, the history of Zionism, right, we have to divide it to Zionism before 1948 and the way that Zionism as a political project, right, because Zionism is a political project, right, manifested itself in the emergence of the Israeli state and the way that it emerged, that is, with its foundational crime of the Nakba, the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians, the destruction of hundreds of villages and Palestinian villages and towns, the destruction of Palestinian life in Palestine, right? From that moment on, right, all the discussions and debate about Zionism before 1948, left wing and right wing, and Zionism and liberalism, and Zionism and nationalism, and all very in the two books that I've written so far, I have whole chapters on this, right? In the region that I studied, in the Carpathian region, on Zionist movements, on Zionist youth groups, on debates among Zionists and debates in the between Zionists and ultra-Orthodox groups in the Jewish world, and so on and so forth. All these debates, which are very important and very interesting, right, are not relevant actually anymore to thinking about Zionism after 1948, right? We have a completely new kind of world afterwards, right? And we can't, say, Zionism had all kinds of potentials, and it did, right? All kinds of potentials and possibilities and very complex histories, and it did, right? But after 1948, we can't imagine that 1948 and Nakba did not happen, and the Israeli state, which is the goal of the Zionist as a political project created in state for Jews, did not emerge as it emerged, right? I want to remind everyone that it was the first Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, who's considered the father of the Israeli state, who himself said that we don't need to talk about Zionism anymore after 1948 because there's an Israeli state. Right? So that's it. Zionism has accomplished its goal, right? We don't need... Ben-Gurion was actually the first post-Zionist, right? In that sense. No more Zionism in that sense, almost after 1948 from that perspective, right? So it's very important to understand that when we talk about Zionism after 1948, right, we are... And the way that it's also seen as, tied, obviously, to the emergence of the Israeli state, also as a response to the Holocaust, right, to genocide, then we are not talking about, right, a Jewish identity in the sense that if you criticize a Jewish identity, right, it is an anti-Semitic move, right? We are talking about a political position, right, and a political project that has now become a state, right? That's what we're talking about, right? And we have, so again, the conflation of a people and a state, right? It's an essential element in the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, that project of the Israeli state, right? We have to separate these, right? We have to understand that critiquing a state, right, a state is very different than a people, right? And critiquing a state and critiquing Zionism after 1948, right, is about critiquing a political project that emerged, right, as discriminatory, as exclusionary, right, as violent, and eventually, as we see today in Israel's assault on Gaza, as extremely violent, right? Now, it's important to say one more thing about this here. When we think about, so I already said that when Israel emerges, right, it emerges as a nation state, as explicitly, right? No one argues that it's not a nation state, right? And as I said today, one of its basic laws explicitly is the fact that it is an exclusionary nation state. But as I mentioned, the law also employs specifically settler colonial language. So it's about Jewish settlement in Israel, right? And it's about the state's responsibility to promote Jewish settlement, right? Now, why do I mention this? Because when Israel emerged, it didn't just emerge as a nation state, which is already a problem in itself, because we have to understand it reproduces, right, a political structure, the nation state system, that targeted Jews for discrimination, marginalization, exclusion, and eventually violence, right, and extreme violence. Israel reproduced that in its emergence as a nation state, right? But it also emerged as a settler state, immediately. Now, I always say, don't, in order to go beyond this debate of Israel and settler colonialism, right, and Zionism as settler colonialism, right? Zionism is the idea of creating a Jewish state, right, in Palestine. Then we should listen to what Zionist leaders themselves told us about the project. And there's a lot to say about this, but of course, as many others have done, we should, for example, listen to Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, right-wing Zionism, what he wrote in a seminal text that's very well known, The Iron Wall from 1923, and everyone can find it online in English translation and the Jabotinsky Institute website, right? And this is it's a short text. It's very clear, right? It's actually an internal Zionist debate in essentially the text. And Jabotinsky is arguing with left-wing, what he considers at the time were considered left-wing Zionists, and he tells them, he says, look, Zionism is a settler colonial project, right? It's a colonial project, he says, right? And he says, let's face it, we want to create a state where there are Palestinian Arabs. That's how he calls Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs, right? And he said, do you know, he asks his fellow left-wing Zionists, do you know of any colonial project in the world that the indigenous population accepted? And he says, it's a rhetorical question, of course. He says, of course not, right? So he says, the options are very clear. Either Zionism stops, right? Or it proceeds regardless of the indigenous population, right? So for Jabotinsky, the settler colonial element of Zionism was absolutely clear, right? He didn't deny it. He didn't say, no, it's not settler colonialism. How dare you say it's settler colonialism or anything like that. He said, this is the premise. We have to understand this is the premise. We want to create a state where there are people, right? It's a colonial project. Nowhere in the world this idea was accepted by indigenous people, right? The dispossession, right? The expulsion from their land, turning them into unwanted people in their homeland, right? And therefore, either we don't do Zionism, right? Or we do it regardless of the indigenous population. Now, Israel was established as a settler state, and it's now become, manifested in its basic law, its constitutional law, as a nation state as well, which tells us that it was established at the intersection of the nation-state system and settler colonialism. Both of these political structures and processes, as I said, were very, very significant in the targeting of Jews for marginalization, for exclusion, for violence, ultimately for extreme violence. So Israel reproduced, actually, right, the political structures of anti-Semitism. In a way, Israel, as a settler state, right, actually reproduced what I call settler anti-Semitism, right? Now, this is very, very important because, of course, this had to be continuously blurred, right? So, of course, for example, we have Nakba denial, right? From the very beginning, right? The denial of this foundational crime becomes part of the effort to blur this nature of the Israeli state as an exclusionary and violent nation state and settler state, actually, right? But also the project of the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, right, that emerged in the 1990s is tied to this idea, to the understanding of Zionism after 1948, right, as a settler project, right, as manifested in a settler state. So critiquing Zionism, right, critiquing Zionism is actually, in this sense, very much critiquing Israel after 48, right? This is after 48, right? Critiquing Zionism is critiquing Israel. There is no, we can't, for academic purposes, of course, we can delve into the debates about Zionism before 1948. But in the world around us today, after 1948, we can't anymore say, let's talk about the potentials of Zionism, right? Because Zionism already manifested itself in a very concrete way in the creation of Israel through the Nakba as an exclusionary nation settler state, right? Now, on the other hand, anti-Zionism in the Jewish world, which is as old as Zionism, right? And in many cases, was a legitimate and in many cases widespread view actually among Jews, right? And also continued to exist after 1948, of course. By the way, also in some cases in Israel itself, right? Anti-Zionist Jews. And it is itself a very complex and long history, of course, right? But now we're in a situation, right, that tells us that basically if you're an anti-Zionist Jew, right, then you become an anti-Semite, right? So again, which is my experience, right? So this delegitimization of something that it was common and actually in some cases very dominant in the Jewish world right before 1948 and is becoming more and more now actually in some cases dominant and anti-Zionist position among Jews, right? You can only be a Jew in this perspective, right, if you're a Zionist. You can only be a Jew in this perspective, right, if you're a Zionist, right? And this is a key, actually, element of the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism as it became kind of enshrined in the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism in 2016 and its accompanying 11 examples, 7 of which deal with Israel, that basically it conflates, right, Jews and Zionism, again, Jews and the state of Israel, in a way that means that you can only be a Jew today, right, if you're a Zionist, if you identify in some way positively with the state of Israel, which is absolutely ahistorical, right, completely ahistorical, of course, right, but as I said at the beginning, is actually in itself anti-Semitic because this actually is an assault against the Jewish identity, right? That is, of course, tied to resistance to a political project, but it's not in itself a political project, right? And again, it goes back to this distinction between a people and a state, right? So this is all very important in order to understand that no, critique of Zionism today, right, is legitimate. It's a critique of a political project. It is critique of a state. And also, again reminds us how Zionism, as tied to the state after 1948 and the Holocaust, right, became pillars of a Jewish identity, and how important it is because Jews continue to live, of course, in many places around the world, right? Many, also after the Israeli state emerged. So what shall we say? Shall we say, as actually both President Biden and former President Trump told American Jews in various ways, right, that they are actually Israelis, right? Both of them, both Biden and Trump, told American Jews, right, in various ways, right, sometimes more explicit, sometimes less explicit, that they really are, that their state is really, that is really Israel. That's actually anti-Semitic, right, because that plays into immediately the double loyalty anti-Semitic idea, right? So American Jews are not actually Americans, right? It's so important, right, to disentangle this, right? A critique of Zionism is not a critique of a Jewish identity. It's a critique of a political identity. That's the key here.
Is there a version of Zionism prior to 1948 that doesn't involve settler colonialism?
We have to understand that, yes, Zionism emerges also in response to anti-Semitism, right? To the exclusion of Jews, as I explained, right? Absolutely, right? But we also have to understand, right, that there were actually forms of Zionism in terms of, we can say Zionist ideology if we want, and we can say Zionist, organizing and various Zionist groups, right, that did focus much more, right, on Jewish life where Jews had always lived, right, in the places where they had lived, right, rather than on the project of creating a Jewish state, right. Now, the important thing to say here, right, is that to understand that the Zionism and manifested itself as a political project of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, or let's even say creating a Jewish state not in Europe, right, reaffirmed an anti-Semitic perspective that Jews don't belong where they had always lived, right? This is very, very important. It does actually tie into the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism. So yes, there were people who in practice, also in their ideological framework of Zionism before 48, and also in practice, right, in various places around the world and in Europe, thought about the lives of Jews where they were, right? And that's very important to say, right? But it's also important to understand the difference after 1948 that reaffirmed the anti-Semitic. So again, there is this way in which tragically, right, the Zionist project that manifested itself politically in the Israeli state after 1948 reproduces, we might say, an anti-Semitic view of the world, right? That's how Israel becomes a settler state, right? A settler project.
Let's move to our sort of last section, which is the background and development of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and some of the efforts to respond to that definition, to counter it with alternatives. And you are working on projects that include that, that involve that effort. We see today on campuses and elsewhere the gradual adoption and the formulation of sort of a legal standard, something that if you cross, then you have actually violated the law. Can you tell us a little bit about the IHRA definition to begin with, and the extent to which this can actually become codified in ways that actually criminalize the violation of this definition, given frankly how interpretive this whole task can be at the end of the day in terms of whoever is trying to interpret statements and so on.
Yeah. So, but there has to be something to, we have to place this within the history of the last 25 years of the project to weaponize the struggle against anti-Semitism. And I want to emphasize again that in many cases we hear about the weaponization of anti-Semitism, but that's not actually correct. It's the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, right? And as I said, this emerges as an Israeli project in the 1990s. Now, why specifically in the 1990s, which is very important? Why then does Israel decide that there is an urgency, right, to do this as a state project, right? Why? Because in the 1990s, we have the emergence of a significant discourse, right, about Israel as a settler colonial project so it's a discourse that is well beyond just Palestinians and Palestinian scholars who've always discussed Israel as a settler colonial project, right, since the 50s, right? But in the 1990s, it's starting to become a more accepted way to think about Israel, right, beyond Palestinians and Palestinian scholars. And it has to do with actually the role of Israeli Palestinian scholars in talking about Israel as a settler colonial project, but it also has to do about the rise of thinking about the US and Canada and Australia as settler colonial state and the role of indigenous scholars in that, right? So settler colonialism becomes a more important category in thinking about these other settler states, right? And there's actually in the 1990s there's starting to be more and more discussion about oral histories of the Nakba, right? Which, of course, point us to, again, what Palestinians have always talked about, an ongoing Nakba, right? And so basically, again, Israel as a settler colonial state. All this becomes more and more pronounced in the 1990s, and it's viewed as as a real threat by the Israeli state, right? And it's a real threat, right, because it exposes the fact that Israel actually reproduced an anti-Semitic view of the world, right? And that indeed we can actually think about Israeli state violence, past and present, right, in the frame actually of thinking about this anti-Semitic, racist, settler exclusionary framework, right, of the nation-state system and settler colonialism. So this is a big threat, right, to the Israeli state, opening up all these connections and questions, and of course, even imagining that the Israeli state reproduced actually anti-Semitism, right? As I said, has actually become a state that reproduces settler anti-Semitism in this way. And this could seem very odd, right? How can the Jewish state, right, reproduce anti-Semitism? Well, again, we have to understand that Israel is a state, not a people, right? It's always interesting to think, on the one hand, Zionists say, well, especially after the Holocaust, Jews deserve a state. They have to be like all other people, right? Normal, right? So we deserve a state like all other people. It doesn't matter, of course, that many, many people around the world don't have a nation state, right? But so you have to decide, right? Either is this, is this a normal, does this normalize Jews or does this exceptionalize Jews, right? So in the 90s, when we have this discourse that becomes a big, danger for the Israeli state, right? Because indeed, it threatens to expose how it's normal, right? In that sense, right? So there emerges this state project to weaponize the struggle against anti-Semitism by shifting the focus away from Jews and onto Israel as a Jewish state, conflating a people and a state. This is the context now that we need to understand. Eventually, the rise of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism in 2016, right? Now we have to also say a few words about the fact that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is, as its name suggests, an institute of what we call global Holocaust memory. It's like other institutes of global Holocaust memory, like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, like Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, right? These are state institutes. The IHRA is made up of state delegates of 35 member states, almost all of them from Europe, but it also includes Israel and the United States and Argentina and Australia, Canada. Might have forgotten a couple, but it's primarily European states. And it's an organization that deals with Holocaust memory and education. It's particularly, of course, crude, right, that this weaponization becomes very significant through, right, Holocaust memory, right? Because it really then also does involve the weaponization of the Holocaust, right, in this framework, which again deserves, much more discussion in itself, right, this element of weaponizing the Holocaust. Of course, in the Israeli state project more broadly, but specifically in the project to weaponize the struggle against anti-Semitism. And it's important, of course, to put this on the table because the IHRA working definition is in the framework of an organization that deals with Holocaust memory and education. And of course, the definition itself has a longer history, and it's important to say what many people have said, right, that one of the people who drafted the initial definition that eventually became the IHRA definition in 2016 was Ken Stern, who was a major figure in the American Zionist world, right? I once invited Ken Stern together with Joyce Ajlauni, who's a Palestinian American, to have an event about the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism and the IHRA definition. And in one point in this, it was a Zoom event with Joyce and with Ken. At one point, Ken said, I don't remember exactly what was the context. He said, I'm a Zionist, right? And it's actually very important. He says that a lot, actually, in these kinds of events. It's actually very important because Ken Stern, who was one of the people who drafted the original definition, right, has written since the IHRA definition was adopted in 2016, right, that he completely opposes this weaponization, right? So a Jewish American Zionist who was very, very important in the in the drafting of what became in 2016 the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, opposes it. Why does he oppose it? Why has the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism created such a rupture in the Jewish world? Why has it created such a debate in the Jewish world, right? We need to understand there is a massive disagreement, right, in the Jewish world about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, right? There's no agreement about this, right? I mean, there's really no agreement about anything in the Jewish world, of course, but there's no agreement about that as well, right? So why has it created such a disagreement? What is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism? So, as everyone can see online, the definition includes two main pieces. One is the definition itself, which is very vague, actually. It's not really a definition, but it's not the problem, right? The problem is that it has 11 examples attached to it, right? And they're considered an integral part of the definition. And 7 of the 11 examples are about Israel and about Zionism, not about Jews at all, right? In that way, the definition, what it does, right, is indeed conflates a people and a state. It does what it aims to do. That is to shift the focus away from Jews and onto a state. And in that sense, to police, right, what people can or cannot say, even before we come to the legal issues, right, incorporating into the definition into law. But just because anti-Semitism is such a significant discourse in the West, right, and unless you're a proud anti-Semites, as the original anti-Semites were, right, then people don't want to be identified, God forbid, as anti-Semites, right? And in some places in Germany, for example, it could cost you your job, right? So it's a very powerful discourse, right? And once you shift the focus from Jews to Israel, right, and you say that a critique of Israel basically is anti-Semitic, right, then that has very significant power. It intimidates, it silences, it polices speech. Now, people will say, well, let's look at the IHRA definition. It says that a critique of Israel that is like any critique of other states cannot be considered anti-Semitic, right? So it has this language before the examples, right? But then what happens? We look at the examples and we say, one of the examples says, for example, that if you talk about Israel as a racist state, right, that's anti-Semitic. But wait a second. I can talk about the United States as a racist state. So many people have talked about the United States as a racist state, right? I can talk about Canada as a racist state. I can talk about Australia as a racist state. I can talk about Germany as a racist state. So why can't I talk about Israel as why is that anti? So again, we come back to this, is the project of creating a state for Jews normalizing Jews, or is it exceptional? So the idea that there are double standards, that we single out Israel for critique, it's exactly the opposite. The IHRA definition is a double standard. It tells us that we cannot actually, contrary to the language before the examples, that we cannot actually critique Israel like we critique any other state, that it's racist, even though there is a library of research, right? Documented, the documented reality about Israeli racism, past and present, right? We can't refer to it, right? All these scholars, many of which are Israelis and Jews, by the way, right, who've written about this, right, are anti-Semites, right? Now, notice another thing that happens with this example about racism, right? What is, of course, at the core of settler colonialism? Racism, right? So this is a very interesting way of saying that you can't say that Israel is a settler colonial state without even mentioning settler colonialism, right? We don't even mention it. We just say you can't say that Israel is a settler state, is a racist state. That's anti-Semitic. It's contrary to the text of the definition itself. It's a double standard. It exceptionalizes Israel, right? And it polices speech. It intimidates. It chills. It creates the conditions that people will say, this is too dangerous, right? I'm not going to get into it as well, at all, right? By conflating, again, this conflation of a people and a state, right? Now, what happens, since 2016, right? This campaign, right, for the IHRA definition to be adopted by universities, by companies, by cities, by school districts, has been actually very successful, right? Unfortunately, very successful. Now we have a new kind of assault, right? An effort to get it integrated into legislation, right? And we have the Antisemitism Awareness Act, right? What the Biden administration has suggested for legislation, actually. And we have various efforts to integrate the IHRA definition into law. Now, when we look at the text of the IHRA definition, the text itself, again, there's an internal contradiction here, because it says that this should not be legally binding, right? Non-legally binding, right? So what are we talking about here? Now, think about it, and this goes back to my case, right? But not only to my case, right? The attack against me in the University of Minnesota with which I started, right? This is a crude violation of First Amendment rights, right? I mean, besides the distortion, as I explained, that's inherent in this weaponization, right? Israel is not a racist state, right? Even though we know that it is founded as a racist state, right? But it's also a crude violation of First Amendment rights to say that you can't critique a state, you can critique any other country in the world, and that's perfectly fine, including the U.S., right? In the U.S., but you can't critique Israel. Crude violation of First Amendment rights, right? In the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of the Biden administration, right, it says that nothing in this law should be used to violate First Amendment rights, right? But of course, as we know, this could be included in the text of a law, and it could still violate First Amendment rights, as my case demonstrates, right? The university, right, as we say without blinking, right, absolutely violated my First Amendment rights here, right? Beyond anything else that we said about this, right? Now, this would be, tremendously, this would be really horrific, right? Integrating into law. It would, of course, strengthen this assault, this policing speech, this intimidation, right? And it would indeed ensure, right, this is the core of the Israeli state project of the weaponization of anti-Semitism. It would ensure, right, that you could not, right, talk about Israeli state violence against Palestinians. You could not talk about the Nakba, right? This would be another level also of Nakba denial that we've seen as a structural element in Israel and the West since 1948, right? You could not talk about the Nakba. You could not talk about current Israeli state violence. You could definitely not say that Israel's assault in Gaza is genocidal, right? You could not do any of these things. It would become illegal, right? It would become illegal. This is, again, this would exceptionalize Israel. It is itself a double standard. It's a horrific world turned upside down, because again, the struggle against anti-Semitism is about protecting a people from violent and exclusionary states. And here we have a state project indeed, to protect a state, right, from any critique and actually discussion of its ongoing, past and present, and ongoing violence against the people, Palestinians, right? But there's another thing. So all this has created a massive debate in the Jewish world, right? And has, people who, for example, anti-Zionist Jews like myself, right, oppose all of this, right? So, of course, this is very convenient, because the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism threatens now to criminalize anti-Zionist Jews, right, it would not just be discursively anti-Semitic, right? It would be criminal to be an anti-Zionist Jew, right? This is what we might think about in the framework of really structural systemic absurdity, right? And of course, we live in a world where absurdities are blowing up in front of our eyes all the time, right? We just had to, watch the presidential debate a couple of days ago in order to absurdities blowing up constantly in front of our eyes, right? But this is a big absurdity, right? And it's created a massive debate in the Jewish world. The idea that supporters of the IHRA definition, Israel and its supporters, are saying that this represents the interest of Jews, right? So again, this self-proclaimed idea that Israel is a Jewish state and it represents all Jews around the world, right? So you can only be a Jew if you're a Zionist and you identify with Israel, is absolutely wrong. It's a distortion of the reality in front of our eyes, right? Where the Jewish world is absolutely split on this, very significantly, right? There's actually an unprecedented rupture, right, in the Jewish world today that's manifested, in a lot of heated debates, and also, friendships are broken up, families are in ruptures, communities, right? So this idea that this represents the interests of Jews, what is the interest of Jews, right? What is this? It's a national framework. You can only be a Jew if you are a national Jew, that is, if you're a Zionist, if you support Israel, which is absolutely not the case, right, in the Jewish world today. But one last point about this that's important to emphasize, of course, right, is that all this shifts the focus away from the real struggle against anti-Semitism. And it's important to say that a lot of the people, the non-Jews who are engaged in supporting this weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, right, and this attack on anti-Zionist Jews, and this attack on in order to silence critique of Israel and Israeli violence against Palestinians, are themselves anti-Semites, are themselves white supremacists, right? And it's not by accident, right, that we are shifting the focus away from Jews, and there's very real anti-Semitism today in the world, but we're shifting the focus away from that, right? And think about it. Since 2016, when you think about the year that the IHRA definition emerged, has anti-Semitism diminished since 2016? Is this alleged struggle against anti-Semitism in the framework of the IHRA definition worked? No. What we have seen is actually an increase in anti-Semitism, and specifically in anti-Semitic violence in the United States, right? Of course, we can think about the Tree of Life mass murder in the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, right? But we can still think of many other cases that have happened actually since 2016 of anti-Semitic violence, right? So this idea, we see the results of the weaponization of anti-Semitism in the world around us today by the fact that Jews have not become more safe, more protected. No, the states have shifted the focus together with the Israeli state project, right? Together with Israel and its supporters, from protecting Jews, right, to protecting a state, and especially shifted the focus away from thinking about Jews in any other way than as in the national framework that a Zionist as identified with Israel. And that's why it's not by accident that this whole project now indeed threatens, for example, and Jews who have identities of any other identities except Zionism, and particularly anti-Zionist Jews. This actually puts them in very specific danger, right? Doesn't protect them at all, right? It puts them in danger. It targets them. My case shows this, but there's, I would say hundreds of Jews today, if we just think about the academic world in the US, right, who are targeted actually because of what they've said and written or taught, right, about Israel, Palestine, past and present.
Raz, what are your thoughts on those who might be watching and seeing what I'm seeing, which is this camera with the let me see, with the "Save Me" on your T-shirt. Can you just clarify that you're not being kidnapped, or and this is not a subliminal message?
Well, the T-shirt says "Save me, save our planet." It has an environmental context, and no, I'm not held here against my will. Bassam. No, I just really like this T-shirt, and I do think that we all need saving. Indeed, we need to do more to, of course, save ourselves in this context. But this has an environmental context.
Thank you so much for all of the foregoing. It's a lot to think about and process, and I don't want to keep you longer than we had discussed, but I would like you to leave us with any final comments or last words on the current situation, and how might someone who is genuinely concerned, not even just experts or advocates, but someone who's genuinely concerned with the untold human toll that we are witnessing in Gaza as a result of Israel's genocide, what would be your sort of advice for people who want to continue to speak out?
You know, I think that what we're seeing is it's a very horrific assault on documented reality. It's not by accident, also, of course, that the academic world is at the center of this assault, or one of the central spheres of this assault, because documented reality is a threat, right, to the nation state system as a whole, and to the Israeli state, right, in particular, right. So I would, my what I would say is that we need to continue to insist to forefront this reality in any way, all the time. What do I mean? I mean the reality of Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, which, by the way, this whole weaponization attack is also a distraction, right? It's designed as a distraction, right? Don't look at this mass, in genocide or not, don't look at this massive project of state violence, of mass atrocity, right? That's unfolding now in front of our eyes, televised for almost a year now, right? With horrific, just the recent, right, dropping of the a massive bomb on forcibly displaced Palestinians in the last few days, right, in a tent area full of tents with forcibly displaced Palestinians, right? Don't look at this unfolding case of mass atrocity. Certainly don't put it in any larger context, right, of Israeli state violence. Look at, let's talk about this weaponized view of anti-Semitism. So this is a distraction as well. But there is a lot of the documented reality. We have, as I said, libraries about research on Israel-Palestine, past and present, right? And the goal of this weaponization campaign, the goal is to make sure that everyone is scared, sufficiently scared, right, to talk about this, to raise this, to study this, to teach this, right? And the basis of the struggle against it, right, is that we all together, right, this has to be collective action, continue to forefront, right, these documented realities, right? It can't be just one person here, one person. It has to be a collective effort, right? It's easy to shut down one person, 5 people, 10 people, right? It's impossible to shut down 100,000 people, right? So and this is happening, right? We are seeing an unprecedented mobilization of students on campuses, of faculty on campuses, right, against this. An unprecedented movement on U.S. campuses since the Vietnam War, right, against this. We're seeing there's more and more people in the Jewish world and outside of the Jewish world who are saying no, right? We will not give in to this horrific, basically, project of denial, right? And, from a Jewish perspective, and I'll end with this, right? From a Jewish perspective, of course, when we think about denial, we think about Holocaust denial, right? For example, right? This is an absolutely, and this is what we're looking at, right? Nakba denial and the denial of the ongoing Nakba, including the denial of Israel's assault on Gaza now. So we have to think about it in this framework, right? Of Holocaust denial, of Nakba denial, right? Certainly, from my perspective, as a scholar of the Jewish world, as a Jew, as an American, as an Israeli, right? This is absolutely unacceptable, right? And it has to be a collective effort, right? And we support each other in various ways of continuing to throw this documented truth in the face of the people who seek to shut us down and to intimidate us, right? It has to be a collective effort where the truth is what guides us.
Thank you so much, Raz, for everything that you have shared with us. And I don't have much to say. I do have a lot more questions, but I cannot abuse your generosity. So I hope we can speak with you again and probably, hopefully, meet under better circumstances.
Thank you so much, Bassam. Thank you.